stories, about people's stories. So when we look actually and we go back through time, the importance to us as a species of stories and how we communicate is so massive. In fact, if we go back, the first stories that were actually recorded, you can go back to Lascaux Caves in the Pyrenees Mountains in southern France, which between 15,000 and 13,000 BC, they found cave paintings. They found paintings that dated back to that time frame, which at first seemed like random scribbles and lines and all sorts, but it turned out that actually it told a story, and it was animals and a human being, and it told of rituals performed and hunting practices. And it's the first time we could actually see that a story was recorded. But before then, the way we pass down information to tribe, from person to person, came through stories. And we are very unique as human beings, as being the only species that can really have a level-headed imagination. We can dream up, and it has brought us closer together throughout history. The reason human beings were able to communicate and why they were able to build tribe together is through unifying through causes, whether it be religion, whether it be through spirit, whether it be through countries. The idea of countries is an imaginary concept, right? These borders and these realms of possibilities. And they all came from a fundamental feeling and a fundamental story. And if you even look at how you went through your childhood, or how I went through my childhood, or Trenchia, or any of us, you realize that you start to learn about the world through stories. You think about right and wrong. It's not, just don't do that. You ended up getting a story like Don't Cry Wolf and all sorts, which allowed you to emotionally connect. And it allowed you to actually realize the reason and the why behind why you don't do something, and that sort of follows its way through history and through the evolution of our species. So what I really enjoy, and I have a few books I'll recommend at the end, but a great book to really dive into that is Mythos. And it talks a lot about Greek mythology and how that had such a mixture between history and mythology, because before we could write things down, before we actually started to establish history, a lot was told through those stories. And it's how we made sense of the world. Helios, the god of the sun, and Zeus, god of the sky. And it became a way of actually understanding the world around us. And even then we were communicating and connecting on a story and on an emotional level. And fast forward from there, history is a story. You end up following it, and it's a series of stories that can teach us a lesson, can give us insights into a variety of different concepts, or it can entertain us. So every story really serves a purpose, even if it's just to relay a message. And without these histories, without these stories, mankind would never learn from their mistakes. We would never dream to emulate our heroes. We would never see anything but the now, see what's in front of us now. And a really great storyteller, if we look at today's day and age and how it's even applied to business, is Steve Jobs. He was very famous for his own keynote speeches. So whether he was launching a new product or making an announcement, or, people were amazed by his ability to create a narrative, to maintain suspense, and to deliver a solid message with dazzling effects and, CX and stuff for their new products. And when he was gone and when he passed away, Apple changed. It wasn't the same company. And a lot came through how his ability to chime into different stories. So if there's something you take from today's session, is a big part of that is, if you can effectively communicate a story and a why behind why you do things, people trust you more. People believe what you're getting into. Very much in business, we end up saying what we do. We end up saying, if you were pitching in a sales room, you might say, this is our product, this is what it does, and people don't buy into that. When you're going to get a promotion or you want to get additional training, you need to be able to understand where you're going and what your purpose is and what your why is and why that actually exists. So the idea behind our session today, and what Trenchia will get into and break it down in various different sections, is the idea of being able to identify and know your own story, and then how to effectively communicate that to others. And that's why it can apply to so many different concepts. And I love the idea of bringing it back to a narrative, bringing it back to a story, because you can kind of simplify the way you need to communicate your message. And today we are going to cover internally how you can do that, externally, how you can do that through social media. How do you do that through pitching to investors? Why would that make sense? But what I wanted to get across before we started was this is actually rooted deep into our own DNA, into who we are as a species. And when you actually understand that and you kind of get it through, it starts to make more sense as to why you should bring it back to those experiences and to those stories. But the first thing anyone needs to do before you can try to communicate your own story is understand your own story. So this has been a big topic between me and Trenchia. We talk about it all the time. I think it's so important. But I guess I'm going to start with a bit of a question and bounce it straight back to Trenchia and say, look, how, as a story, with the impact on us as youth and as species, can you kind of take us through, probably as a career coach, how can you start to recognize what your own story is? And I think it probably takes an element of being introspective and being able to analyze yourself, but what's maybe the first step? We've talked now about this story piece, but now, okay, great. We want to communicate through stories. How do you identify your own story?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think, for me, I will take it back to how I've started uncovering the art of storytelling. I was trying to really figure out what my purpose is, what's my calling, and a mentor actually asked me a question, simple question. It seems simple, but it's actually quite deep in terms of who are you? So who am I? Who am I as a person? Because before you try to figure out where do you want to go, you need to know where you've come from. And I always say this is knowing where you've come from is really your story, where you were born, who are the people that influenced your life, who are the people that inspired you, who are the people that invested in you, what experiences shaped you. So whether it's just in childhood, just on the playground, in schools, coming to university, into your job, you have colleagues that, are good to you, not so good to you. Every experience shapes you. So, and this shapes the story. And for you to understand who you are, you need to look at what are those breadcrumbs that have been left along the way that ultimately add up to where you are today in your present day, because they shape you. Good experiences, bad experiences, they do shape you, they influence you. So it's important to actually go back and look at those different experiences and draw from that. I think, when people talk about failure and they look at it as, oh my gosh, I'm not successful. But, recently I've been following some really inspirational people. One of the guys is Gary Vaynerchuk, and he was like, if you failed, great, that's amazing, because that's when you learn, actually. So I think it's, the way we look at these different experiences, that's the important thing. How do you look at it? What are you gaining from it? And the lessons learned. And I think one of the things that we are not doing a lot of at this moment in time, and maybe COVID has helped us do it, is actually to stop and reflect on those experiences. What have you learned? To really go deep, and it takes it's hard work, actually. I've been chatting with one of my clients, and she's like, this is hard, it's tough, because you need to actually dig deep, and thoughts and memories that you've packed away because you haven't drawn from them, or you haven't thought about them because you're constantly running forward. You're climbing a ladder, this corporate ladder, and you keep moving, but you don't stop to reflect, what have I learned? What have I learned in the process? So I think that's the key to really creating a deep and meaningful story that you get to share with people, is when you have actually done that deep work yourself and looked internally. Yeah.
I love that, because there's one thing, talking about failure is one of the things that comes up in interview questions a lot, right? Is when people fail. And we were, I've gone through talking about how people need to be able to communicate the lessons learned and the background. And we talk about in recruitment, the STAR method, but we talk about the situation and describing the whole thing and being strategic and being able to identify what went wrong, But
Yeah.
then what did you learn from it? And actually, if you can communicate that
Mm.
effectively, people like that you've learned from mistakes and from failures.
Yes.
You know, one of the things that comes up very often is when people can't identify weaknesses, or they can't be honest with themselves about what's gone wrong. But to a degree, being able to open up and put yourself, you know, out there means that someone can trust you more, because you're being
Yes.
vulnerable. And we talk
Yes.
about being vulnerable as leaders, and we talk about being vulnerable to the people we manage.
Yes.
It's not that you just say, you can't be a vulnerable leader by sitting there and saying like, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm freaking out, you know, like, you
Yeah.
know, panic would ensue.
Yeah.
You saw
Yeah.
Boris Johnson do that, you
Exactly.
lose your mind. But being vulnerable means actually much more of saying, hey, this is where I've made mistakes, this is what I've taken from it, this is what I've learned on it. And even that on its own is a story, and you take
Yes.
people on a journey.
Yes.
And I like that. And obviously your life is a mixture of achievements and mistakes and
Yes.
errors, and
Yeah.
what you need to be able to do. And what obviously you're saying is,
Yeah.
how do you take all those experiences and build it into a story?
Exactly. I think, you know, one of the questions that comes through with people that I'm coaching and talking to is, where do you start?
Mhm.
How do you actually craft the story? Is there a formula? Is there a structure? I'm an engineer by profession, so I love process. I love steps. It really helps me to just compartmentalize and then be able to see that, step back and see the full picture. So I'm going to share with you just four steps, four parts of a story rather, because, you know, if we look at the greatest movies, what makes them great? The things that make them great is that the storyteller actually takes you on a roller coaster of emotions. They take you on the ups, they take you on the downs. There's some turns, there's left turns, right turns, and then you get to, you know, to the end. But it's not, it's a means to the end. It's not about the end itself, because the whole journey is what was impactful, from start to finish. So it's when you think about your story, it's about thinking about the call. So the call, so the first part is the call to the story. What's the call? Like, why, what's the pull, what's the draw in, what's the hook to the story that people will want to listen? You know, for me, if I tell you, if I just share a little bit, in terms of my call, growing up, I always had this feeling like, am I good enough? I always ask myself that question. And being an introvert by nature, you don't necessarily talk up very much, and you compare yourself to a lot of people, and you compare yourself and you think, oh, but I'm not charismatic, um, I'm not the loudest person in the room, will people listen to me? And you have all these thoughts, and there's a lot of it that comes from self-talk, but you also look at the environment, what's going on around you. So in terms of the call, that's really what I'm talking about, is how do you pull people in to say, how can they identify with you in terms of that story? And I've shared my story many times, and people like, oh wow, I've also had that same thought, I've also had that same feeling. And you can see already in the start, the call to the story is common ground. You establish common ground with somebody that's listening to you, and then you go into, you know, the pit. So where did you actually land up? That was so rock bottom. You know, for some people it may be extremely dramatic, you know, something catastrophic that has happened, something traumatic that has happened in their lives. But it's not always the case. You know, it could, everybody has, it's their perspective that they would feel that pit moment, they would feel that low moment. For me, I can tell you, just fast forwarding, in university, I put so much pressure on myself to achieve, because I had like this, you know, performance anxiety, that I needed to be the best. I actually, one day, I drove my mom and my brother to the shop. I had a massive test on the next day, and literally parked the car, went into the store. We said, we're going to divide and conquer. Each one went into one aisle. I got to the aisle, and all I could remember is black. I collapsed. I had an epileptic seizure.
Oh my goodness.
And I was, yeah, it was full on. There was a doctor in the store at that time. My mom came in. I bit my tongue. Eyes rolled back, everything. So it was a full on seizure. Rushed to the hospital. I gained consciousness there. And the doctor basically said I had like a lightning in the brain, just from stress.
Oh my God. That's
So
incredible.
yeah, that made me look at, what is life. I could have lost my life that day because I was stressing myself to no end, trying to be the best at everything. And I had to re-look at what's on my plate and reorganize. I had to take an extra year at university to finish off, so that I enjoy the process. I was not enjoying the process of studying because I was trying to be the best at it. So that was my pit moments, like again, the failure felt like a failure, like taking longer to finish university. But coming out of that, you're constantly searching and you're constantly asking about this question. And so the third point is the search. You are searching. So what have you been searching for? And sometimes you're searching for affirmation. You're looking for people to say, well done, good job. And you're always looking outside of yourself. When to answer that question, am I good enough? So you keep asking somebody outside of you, and really looking for that moment of breakthrough. So that last point is, what is the breakthrough? And for me, it really came in the last 2 years. I moved to Sweden from South Africa, so went to start life completely from scratch. And just buying bread and milk was an effort in itself, in another language, and where there's a entire fridge of milk, and you just want milk for your cereal, and you're like, can I just find the milk for my cereal? um, and so it really taught me so much. It taught me about the strength I have actually within myself, and that I could do it. I could go and make a home there. I could make friends. I had a church family, and really that question was that I kept asking myself was, am I good enough? And it is yes. The answer is yes. My story is unique. Everybody's story is unique. So me making this decision to transition out of engineering into being a leadership coach and career coach and trainer, 10 years ago, if somebody said that to me, I would have laughed in their face and been like, no ways, I'm not going to be doing that. I'm going to stay within what I know in my comfort zone. And really coming through that, my breakthrough was that I could do whatever I put my mind to, because I have shown myself that. My stories, my experiences have shown me that if I put my mind to it, I can achieve it. So it doesn't matter what everybody else thinks. It's I've shown myself that. And there will be people that will pull you down. There will be people that are going to discourage you along the way. But this is where it's important to know your purpose, know your calling, know your why. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you making some of the decisions that you're making? So those four elements in the story: the call to the story, the pit, the search, and then the breakthrough, to really show people that you've come through that, you've come through and gone and taken them on a journey. So that's just a quick version of my story.
I love it. And when you look at, so I'm going to play a bit of comparison here and bring it back to typical stories that people engage with, right? You talked about, and I think I love stories. I like to write, I read tons, and I think it does very much have an applicable place, because you talk about building a narrative, and in your own narrative, you're the protagonist, and you have to overcome a challenge. And both stories are the same, right? They're very similar. They're just recreations, and you'll probably moments, so you're probably watching a bunch of movies and realizing this is the same story I've seen times. There's not that many basic changes, and it is this protagonist that comes against a challenge, right? And whether they fail or they get through it or whatever, there's a lesson learned, and you hit the climax, and and then on the downward course, there's a resolution, story resolution, which can be positive or negative. But what Trench has just done there with us is taken us on a journey and engaged us, and you relate with things emotionally. And that's where a lot of these pieces and this information that people many times don't include in stories is why people can't connect. And when you talk about how you might want to, and this leads us very well into our next section, we talk about now internally within a business. We've talked about stories holistically, about ourselves holistically, how you communicate that story and why it's so important. But if you're then sitting with your manager and you want to understand where you want to go and who you are, the more you
Yes.
can open up and the more you can discuss your story, the more you can open yourself up to opportunity. And people can actually believe in what you want to do. You know, you're not just doing that training class to do a training class. It fits with your narrative, fits with what you're trying to overcome. In an, you know, in a internal interview, you are telling, you know, you're building up why you want that role, what you've gone through challenge wise, etc. But this works very well with you, I think, because obviously you need to be able to, within your previous career and as an engineering manager and direct, you know, you had team members and you're managing your own career internally, and you were very successful in being able to move, you know, go to a new company and then move to Sweden and take on a whole department. And I think you even had a narrative where you've won very big projects by being able to sell a vision or a dream, and that comes from storytelling. So how can people take these concepts and apply it, let's say, to everyone here internally within their own career?
Yeah. Really, to your point, what you said was understanding what you want first. I think in terms of how you connect with somebody else, they need to understand, they need to see that you believe it, you have passion for it. So like you said, if it's asking for a training course or asking you know, for $1 million, I can give you a quick example. I got $1 million approved in 3 minutes. That was my record. In 2017, I was going to senior leaders for money. It felt like every week, and just asking for money and taking them on a journey. But it was really that 3 minutes came. It was 3 minutes because there was a lot of preparation that happened behind the scenes. It wasn't just that meeting on that particular day. It was a culmination of building relationships, talking to different people, talking to the different stakeholders, telling the story, who would benefit, taking them into the pit. You know, this is the state and condition of the machines, because they don't get to see all this. They don't get to see the behind the scenes. So what is the picture, you know, without painting doom and gloom, what is the picture that you want them to see? You want them to feel the pain that the operator was feeling on the floor. And that the operator doesn't have that voice, but I have that voice. I have the voice to be able to share with the senior leaders, people that are decision makers within the business. I got to share with them, this is the state of affairs, and really take them on a journey that they go, yeah, this is a no-brainer, go for it. Oh, you haven't bought it yet? I thought you bought it already.
Yeah.
So, you know, really where they feel the pain, they feel they were taken on the journey, and they understand the why. It's not about just, I'm asking for this $1 million to buy a packing line. I'm asking to be able to impact people's lives. I'm helping to impact the ergonomics to, you know, for people that are working on the line. So really showing the human side of when you're talking to people and when you're selling, it's telling a story. It's not about, you know, I need the money and this is what we are buying. And that's the superficial. So you need to really go deeper, you know, at least 2 to 3 levels to actually understand why. Why am I asking for this machine? Is it just to have a nice, brand new, shiny stuff in the plant that I could say I bought, or it's really making an impact to somebody's life? So I've always brought my stories back to the ultimate impact. If it's, you know, from a sustainability perspective, what are we gaining from the planet's side? What are we gaining from people perspective? So really bringing it back to the playing on the emotions, taking them on the emotional roller coaster, as it were, to be able to get them to picture themselves there. Yeah.
I think quick thing to mention to everyone on the session, because I think people are replying and we're having people in the chat, but you might just be sending it to us as panelists. So on your chat box, make sure you click all panelists and attendees, because we'd love people to engage with your content as well. But there's an interesting question. We can answer a few questions that have come up directly to us, to me and Shrensha. But one of those comments says, on the topic of connecting, how do you know that your audience will be able to relate to your story? And I think it's really fascinating. That's a great question, because that's the importance of being able to relate to emotion and being able to simplify and build a story, right? People can't relate to something if they don't understand it. You know, from a technical, Shrensha has brought up a really good point. If you're an engineer or you work on, you know, software, you know, speak to so many people within research and development, they get very frustrated, right? Because they try to
Mm.
build an innovation and then they don't get the money they want, and but they're also inherently not very good at expressing their story. They just want this, they want X, they're trying to build this innovation, they can't get it, they get frustrated at work. So, you know, that means that people can't connect with your story. You know, if you're trying to talk about why, I don't know, you need some new software or you need this piece or component, you have to make it relatable to your audience. You have to understand who your audience is when you tell a story, which is the really big part, right? So your audience shouldn't fit your story. Your story should fit your audience, right? So you don't want to find people that relate to what you do. You won't be able to push things through. You want to be able to communicate effectively to who your audience is. So, you know, my conversation will change very differently, and my story and how I communicate that story could change differently if I speak to someone who works in my industry than if I speak to somebody who has no idea what I do, you know, and maybe it's a hiring manager because I work in recruitment. It has to change so that I can get those people emotionally involved. So once you realize how to tell a story, then you need to understand how you can write it for a particular audience. And then you become a storyteller yourself.
Yeah, just to jump in there, it's a great question, because I think, you know, there's two types of stories. And I think the one is your personal story. And somebody asked me recently, it's like, you know, you telling your story, what if, you know, it doesn't resonate with anyone? I have seen it, even if it resonates with one person, even this webinar that we're doing, just one person gets it. For me, that's enough. That's enough. When you talk about your personal story and your life story, your life journey, maybe not everyone's going to identify with the same experiences, but there would be, you know, somebody, maybe not in that moment, but they will remember it and may recall it, because of the way you shared your story. It would stick with them, and they could recall that when the need comes, or when the time comes. But when you're talking about telling stories in business, and I love what you said, it's like, you know, put yourself in the audience's shoes.
Yes.
Put yourself in their shoes. Look at it from their perspective. I had an interesting analogy I heard recently was, you know, there's two people sitting across from each other at a table. Each person writes the number 6 on their piece of paper. Each person thinks they are right, so they lift it up, and then one says, but that's a 9, and the other one says, no, but that's a 6, and because perspective. So the only way to actually compromise is for one person to walk around the table to the other side and really see the perspective of the other person. So I think it's, again, when you're telling stories, it's about, just seeing the perspective from the other side. Put yourself in the shoes of your stakeholders. So if you are asking for a project or for funding, it's think about how would they see it, what questions would they ask you, and tailor your story in such a way that you are actually answering these questions before they even ask it. I think that's where the power comes in. You know, if people, normally you give a presentation and then there's an entire Q&A where you feel like completely ripped apart because, you know, people are poking holes in what you've said. But I think the key is, if you start putting yourself in other people's shoes, you start preempting the questions that may come. I can give you a quick tip. What I used to do, I used to be a fly on the wall in the meetings, even when I was not presenting, to just learn the type of questions that would potentially come from senior stakeholders. So that would give me I would write all these questions down and then form my story to actually answer that and preempt it that may come when I'm actually presenting. So if you have the opportunity, you know, to shadow someone, to just call in and just be a fly on the wall, you know, ask for that. People very rarely would say no. I used to just ask my boss, hey, can I just call in, just to get that experience and that exposure. How are people asking questions? How are people answering questions? The do's and don'ts. And you can also learn from what not to do on these calls. So yeah, that was interesting. That was definitely lessons for me.
I want to address two pieces. We've had two questions coming off the back of that. And I think one is a comment from Alex. And Alex, we will dive into a little bit more on how my view on sales and storytelling, which is kind of our last section of how to communicate, but actually works in well with the external piece, how you communicate. And I want to relate this because Davina has sent us a question. It's to all the panelists. So I'm going to answer that question first, and I think I can then incorporate the comments made by Alex. But Davina said business is not really emotional. So how do you find the balance between business and emotions? And in other words, profit with improvement for employees' quality of work and life. Now, I would challenge you to say that not all business is, I think all business is emotional. And I'm actually going to, not completely, right? Obviously, people are going to not make a decision based on what they love. There's going to have to, you've got to have the data and the background. You know, you still got to have the product. You still have to have a solution that works. You know, people don't buy an emotion, but it does help you sell your solution. So how I'm going to relate this back is Alex has said really interesting thing to the group to say that selling equals storytelling, and the objective is to generate an emotional response. And this fact leads to credibility. And if you're bound to your story, you can generate emotional responses and influences to an audience to have an emotional reaction. And I agree. If you look at how people are marketing products and businesses now, they are looking to elicit your emotional response to why they do what they do. They are the businesses that end up being successful, your Apples, your Netflix, your big businesses, because people buy into what they have. They still have a product, but people can understand why they make that product and they buy into that. And as the consumers become really, has evolved over recent years, it's become more and more important. And I think this relates a little bit to sales because yes, I work in recruitment, I own my own recruitment firm. My intro I always include a story. I know where I stand out versus other people is I take the extra time in my introduction to tell people why I do what I do. You know, I started my career working in the industry that I now recruit for. I talk people through that. They understand why I've become a recruiter and the mission behind what I do before I even get into my products. And we had an incredible, also I'm a host of a podcast. We had an incredible guest, Anthony Gonzalez, who's CEO of Force Impact Technologies, which is a mouth guard company. And he's been pitching his company over and over again. And where he's seen the most success is where people buy into him as a person. And that's the difference, right? People can buy a product. If you ever watch Shark Tank, or you watch any of those kind of where they pitch, those investors buy the person many times more than they buy the product. The product can be fantastic, but they really concentrate on not just the story, but who they are as an individual. If you watch, what's that show called? The Trump one, the one that Trump used to own.
The Apprentice.
The Apprentice. Yeah, you see Lord Alan Sugar here in the UK for the UK version. He invests in people, and he says it continuously. So he knows the talent will follow it. So what I mean by that is when you are, because we're kind of talking specifically about maybe selling a service or perhaps trying to win investment, but internally the same things can apply. So when you are in business trying to get someone to buy into your solution, you want them to feel that emotional piece as to why it's a problem within your department. Say there is something that needs to be fixed. People need to resonate as to why it's an issue for them in the business, not just that it's an issue. And the more that you can get people to relate, not all the time, Davina, you can't always have people relate emotionally. You know, there's going to be certain things that are just problems that need to be addressed or inefficiencies or whatnot. But in many cases, the ability to then relate that to a story or bring people along for the ride means that they're actually invested with your solution. If you think of, me and Tricia we'll talk a bit on this piece because I really like this, but in change management for big organizations, they talk about the why. Where most people don't like change is they don't understand the change itself. They don't understand why the company's doing it, and they see it as a profit, you know, just like you're saying here. It's not emotional, it's just business is making a decision. And a lot of poor businesses do that. A lot of smaller companies, a lot of that don't understand that all of a sudden people are now feeling uncomfortable because they can't trust the business they're in. How do you trust something if they can't explain something to you? When you cut staff, when there's a reduction in salaries, many companies need to actually just be honest with their workforce on what's happening. And they would probably keep more people, and people would actually maybe back what they do. But because that communication stays, it was in a smaller recruitment firm before I started my business, and it's made me grow incredibly because of the actions that were taken by that company that they didn't explain. And it made people feel extremely uncomfortable. Whereas if you had kind of had those people be able to relate to you and understand the problems or the challenges the business was in, it would explain why they've made the decisions they've made. So. And that, I don't know if you have any comments on that, Trincia. Otherwise, we'll dive.
Sure.
This is really a good topic for us to kind of hone in on for probably the last 10 minutes, well, 5-10 minutes before we hit the social media piece of it. Unless anyone has any other questions, we did put a break in here for questions, but I think we're just answering them as they drop in. So don't hesitate. We can break this piece up. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about externally as well. So we're talking a little bit about pitching and pushing your story within an organization and why people relate to it. And, as a manager and as Trincia as a manager, when people can actually open up about their stories and their problems and their stuff, they're much easier to manage, I think, because you understand why they make the decisions they do or why they don't like something. And it's all about communication. I think the same can be said for when people decide to go to interview outside in the external market. One of the things that people do really poorly when they can't interview is they can't tell a story. And I touched on a few of these points earlier in the session where we've talked about how you can, talk about weaknesses or when you're in a situation, how it can go, but how then do you also explain your career? And how do you explain where you've come from and also where you're going? People many times feel uncomfortable about stating the fact that they are wanting to be an MD in 5 years, right? How many people I sit and go, I want to be a manager, I want to be a director, I want to be XYZ, and I love the ambition, but why? How do I relate to why you want to do that? Oh, because I've done this, I've got a passion for what I work on, I want to make this kind of change. Those answers make a lot more sense as to what your motivation is for that, rather than it just being financial. People sometimes think that the reason you want XYZ is for status or money, and people don't connect with that. People never connect well with that. They don't connect with money-driven candidates. So explaining how and why, who you are and what you want, you can actually put it in story form, and you can bring people along for your own journey, and people buy into you as a person.
Yeah. And I love, when you started your company, one of the things we spoke about early on was empowering the candidates to actually understand who they are first before they get presented in front of the client. And you asked me to come on board, which was amazing that all the stars lined up for us to make that happen. But it made so much of sense why we should take that journey to first know who we are, know your values, know your purpose, know what you will say yes to, what you will say no to. I think it's also about understanding, what is your fit? What would fit you as a business, as a leader? Who is attracting you? Which companies are attracting you? Why are they attracting you? Are they, is there a cause that you are aligned to, that you would, not mind working day and night to actually, push that cause forward? So I think it's really about understanding your passion, understanding what you love, before even getting to that interview state. I think, when we will speak a bit about it under the social media piece, but it's also, it all boils down to story. So, I think there were a lot of people that registered was saying that I want to improve my online presence. And I think that's something we will talk about. But the reason why we focus so much of this webinar in emphasizing the point of story and knowing who you are is because that becomes so much easier when you have the content to share. And the content that you share with people, it's nothing that you make up. It's all about yourself, but it's understanding how to package it together, how to put it in a story and create a story that, a 90-second story, a 5-minute story, a 10-minute story, a 15-minute story. You can actually create a skeleton and then build other smaller stories around it. The story I shared with you earlier, that's just a fraction of my full story. But I broke it down and I was able to tell you the bits, the 4 parts of the story. So it's really, if you know your story inside out, what you learned from which experiences, you are then able to pull on these little stories whenever you need it. So in an interview, when a question comes, your brain is an amazing tool that will just pull these things, connect the dots, and be able to share the story. And your guest on your first podcast, Anthony, he was sharing about that. It's the know, like, and trust factor.
Yep.
People will only get to trust you if they first feel like they know you, and if they like you, and then they will trust you, and they will trust you enough to offer you a job. So I
Yep.
think it's really about this know, like, and trust factor. I've seen it work in my business, where people are getting to know who I am, and I'm getting more people reaching out and saying, hey, can we have a chat? I'd love to hear what you're doing. And this is all from nothing. These are people I've never met before. And just from putting out content, putting out just authentic content, I think being vulnerable as well. I think we had a comment just now about being vulnerable, showing vulnerability.
Mm.
It's actually a strength, it's not a weakness, but it's how you actually show that. But it's taking courage to be vulnerable. I think that's the key. You've got to put yourself out there, though. Yeah.
There's comments off the back of that. I love what from Lisa and from Alex, but look, it's an authenticity piece is a trustful thing, right? So you're right. I think maybe we've skipped over a bit. Telling a story doesn't mean making something up where someone can't
No.
connect with you.
Yeah.
You know, authenticity is a big part of why storytelling works. It's because people connect with you on an emotional level. And it makes it easier. You know, the like trust factor is exactly what a story does, right?
Yes.
You know, maybe I'm a bit soppy, but I cried during the last Star Wars, right? It's some story that stuck with me my whole life as a kid. I've been connected with the characters so much. I just saw a message pop up, so I hope it's not something taking a bit. All of a sudden, you go through this journey with them, and it's a fictional story. Yeah, I'm still
Yeah.
sobbing when, you know, I don't want to ruin it for anyone, but one of your favorite characters gets killed off. It's because you've emotionally connected with it. And similarly, I'm not saying you're going to be doing that in a boardroom or make someone cry, but you get so involved in a story that's fictional, you believe it. You believe it to be true, and your body actually kind of, you know, responds to that. So in the same point is actually bringing people along on that emotional journey, and people connect. And the more they connect with you, they trust you. When they trust you, they like you. When they like you, you know, they're going to buy into your concept. Not even when it's just a business proposition, right?
Yeah.
So even if it's just building relationships. So,
Yes.
you know, we talk about how you can influence people within your own business. You influence people by building trust, and you build trust by being able to be vulnerable and tell stories and communicate why you're there and why you're within the business and what you want. And we're coming back again full circle, but why it's so important, as Triantia has mentioned, to know your values and know your business is it allows you then to structure what businesses you should go to and be authentic in that interview. Anyone can list off the values of a company. Anyone can do it. But can you actually relate it to you, and why do they relate with you? And then when you're within that business, can you hold true to those values? Because if you lie in an interview, don't worry. Me and Trent, you probably both know, we've hired people that we go, oh God, you know, they've obviously said a buzzword in an interview, but it's not
Yeah.
actually who they are.
Yes.
But there are people, you know, and there is a way of communicating that.
Mm.
Because I know
Yeah.
we've got about maybe 5-10 minutes before then we can power a few of these last minute questions as well. I want to talk a little bit on social media, and I think we will
Yes.
probably incorporate a whole new session on this because we've gotten a lot of requests about social media. Triantia has been doing
Yes.
a lot of different programs on why it's important, and we've realized that there's a difference, right? So being able to tell a story and network in person. What's funny is people aren't exactly doing that with their social media accounts. So you meet someone, they get to know you, they know about you in the office, you have these touch points, you get to communicate effectively about who you are as a person and what you do, and they get to witness it. In social media, that's not as easy to do, but actually the principles are pretty similar. And as we're going to talk about now, people don't engage so much with it, but with COVID-19 and with everything that's changed in the modern market, it's our new medium of communication, our sad, you know, Aurelian future of ours. But we are now needing to communicate and connect and potentially get jobs and build relationships through the internet. You can actually take the same principles and apply it to your social media. What content are you sharing? You know, are you liking somebody on LinkedIn that's like doing the 25 push-up challenge, right? Or are you sharing content about your industry and about your passion and about what you want to do? And do you actually have something in place? Are there certain companies you want to connect with and follow with and generate interest and conversation and a network around? You can actually still do that online, and it actually doesn't. People actually still connect with content that's really authentic. So,
Yes.
you know, we've looked at people that, you know, there are some viral videos that go live, and Tricia could talk a bit more about this and her program, but they'll, you know, people actually connect with being, you know, I connect with the emotional part to this message, and that this person is real and the
Yeah.
content is authentic, and it's not just selling services.
Mm.
And even I think we're getting honed in so much. And if you look at advertising, I don't know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, from what it's changed from then to now is massive, right? Because what people connect with, it's not just what you see. You know, you might see a new ad for a product 5, 10 years ago, and it might be the first time you've ever seen it. It was more about awareness. Now you've got various companies that enter the market, and as a result, you connect with products like everything's got reviews, and you know, I'm a mad person for reviews, and I want to know what the company does, and I want to know what they're invested in, and our perceptions change. And that's, I think, is more of the human element comes to businesses. And you should realize that when you're then promoting yourself and promoting your own business, which is your profile and your own brand, to your network and to your market. Do you agree, Trenchia?
Yeah, I love it. Kiroshan just sent in a question that says, does the way you tell your story change relative to the medium you use to communicate? So Zoom or versus in-person meetings. So it's actually a complex question, because I've been actually trying to research what stops people, what attracts people on social media versus, you know, knowing how people respond in person. One of the scariest statistics for me was it takes 7 seconds to make a first impression in person, but it takes like 0.2 seconds online. So
Oh,
which is so crazy.
yeah.
You have 0.2 seconds to actually just, you know, someone scrolling, and what are they being attracted to? So I think the key for me, and one thing that I said and I've said to myself, is I want to be the same person in public, in face to face, as I am on social media, and how I write on my stories, how I come across on this webinar, how I speak. It's going to be the same, because no matter which platform you meet me on, I should be the same person. The stories that I say, the stories that I speak on a webinar or on social media that I'm posting every day, it should be my stories. It's the same story. It's the same me. So that's something that I've said to myself. And I think that's where the authenticity comes in, is to, you will not forget who you are. So if you're making up stories, you end up forgetting, what mask did I put on here? What mask did I put on there? And then people will start finding those holes. So I think it's really building the credibility is important. And the way to do that is through being consistent
You have a
across the
voice.
platforms.
You have a
Yeah.
voice. People have a voice.
Yes.
You know, writers talk
Yes.
about it all the time. You know, you read a Stephen
Yes.
King book, you know, it's a Stephen King book. You know, sorry, I keep
Yes.
always bringing it back to story. I got so
Yeah.
excited by the mixture.
Yeah.
You have a voice. You fall in love with your favorite author or your favorite director or
Yes.
whatever. They have a way of doing things or a style or a piece.
Yes.
So I would agree. I think the medium shouldn't change your message. I think the way you present your message could change, right? Like the way, like Trenchia has said, if you've only got a small window, you know, you maybe can't have the time that you might have to make an in-person impression, or as you know, a really great way to put this is the way I potentially sell my business or do an interview. If I do it on the phone or I do it on Zoom or I do it in person, probably not much would change. The medium is still my voice. It's still my speech. It's still how I'd communicate. But then the difference is when you're trying to communicate that same, and I think Trench and I have had this with building our own even company brands. Okay, well, how do we actually generate stuff that's around that business, and how do we create a voice for that business that aligns with our values? And then be able to communicate that effectively. So yeah, and Damina's put something here as well, that obviously each social media does have a different audience and a goal. And you know, I love this. Your Instagram pics cannot be the same as your LinkedIn pics, and there's a place for everything. And again, if you bring it back, you'll love you'll realize that again, it comes down to your audience. So understand your audience, you adjust your message.
Yes.
Message doesn't format of your message needs to adjust. I need to, if it's a email blast, or it's a this, or it's a this, whatever you're using, okay, how are people responding to it? If you're building your own business, using the data like Trenchia has, you can start to realize that actually, okay, how can I get my message across quicker, or with an image, or with something different? So I think to kind of summarize here, as because we're coming to the close of the session, I think at the end of it, we've obviously talked and brought stories through everything. And what we've wanted to show you through the session is that we can connect, stories can be connected through everything that you do in life, and you can actually build your own voice and your persona that you then, you know, push out to your clients, push out to your boss, push out to, and the more that those correlate, the more you'll become authentic, and probably the more successful you'll be, because the people that can communicate those messages, you know, end up being able to get what they want.
Yeah. Lisa has just asked a question. If you are authentic on social media but get zero engagement, how do you stay motivated? And I'd like to just take that on. I think
Oh,
this
sorry, I
is
didn't see that. Was that on?
it's on the Q&A. It's on the Q&A.
Sorry.
So
Whoops. Okay. Sorry. Q&A session.
no worries. So I think it's just for me, one of the programs I've developed is called SoMe Works, Social Media Works. And I think I've been doing a lot of research in this space, why when we look at, you know, the number of likes we get or the followers, actually our brains are releasing small amounts of dopamine every time we see an engagement, we see likes, or we see followers. And so there's actually studies being done now to show that our brains are getting addicted to seeing this. So our engagement is being translated in the number of likes or the number of followers, whereas it should be based on the quality of the engagement. So I would say, you know, to that question, Lisa, you know, people, if they're not commenting or not liking, you know, people are scrolling. Remember I said they're scrolling at, like, you've got 0.1, 0.2 seconds to catch somebody, because the content that's going through someone's hands or on their feed is enormous every day. So for me, I would say, you know, it's not about that. It's not about you seeing the amount of engagement. It's, you know, the quality of it. Who is the message landing on? And if the you know, they reach out, or and maybe that's built over time. That's definitely built over time, because it takes trust. People need to trust you. They need to be able to feel like, you know, they can come to you and ask you a question or write a comment and feel like it's a safe space. Because, you know, it is also open to so many people. I've been seeing, you know, recently some young people posting and, you know, older people are just, you know, dumping on them, like, so people are feeling scared to even say anything, because other people everyone has opinions. So it's about, how do you tune those people out and not feel afraid to just have your piece. So, you know, if anyone is looking for support in terms of how to build this online profile, I have a program. Please reach out to me. It's a step-by-step program in terms of how do you first look at your strengths, look at your purpose, your calling, your experiences. How do you create content? What are you passionate about? So really help you to shape that and craft that before you start just posting on social media. What I've been finding in terms of my posting, if there's a meaning, there's a message behind it, people, it resonates with people and they reach out. Yeah, I would say please reach out to me if you need that support. There's another question from Wiseman. He said, I love your story, Tarancha, very interesting. Were you not skeptical leaving engineering into coaching? And the quick answer is no. And I can tell you, but it was years to come to that decision. It took years. It's really, you know, taking the time to be introspective, that I knew for sure that was my purpose. I posted today on LinkedIn, you know, my purpose statement, and it was really to serve people in the leadership space and serve emerging leaders in that space, still within that engineering frame, the science frame. I'd love to focus on that, but I really wanted to give a voice to topics that people maybe shy away from. You know, like I said, I'm an introverted leader. There's people think that you need to be an extrovert to be a leader. And these are things that we tell ourselves. So I think for me, it's that those were all questions that I answered as, you know, I want to step into this new way. Yeah.
And with a last question, because we've got a minute left, I think we'll
Yes.
just cut it. But
Yeah.
who are your modern day storytelling idols, Trenchia? Do you have any modern day storytelling idols? I've got a
Yeah.
couple.
Yeah. So for me, the person that really, there's two people. One is Simon Sinek. I love the way he tells stories. He uses, real life, going into the Marine Corps, pulling stories about leadership from different places that you'd never have seen it, thought of going and checking before. And then John Maxwell, who's been my mentor from the start of my career. His entire business is based on storytelling and really teaching valuable content through stories, to be able to drive the point home, to be able to crystallize that point in people's minds. So for me, they are my
I've got
idols.
I've got two, and I've even brought the books that I'd recommend everyone read, especially if you've really enjoyed off the back of the conversation, because I think they're extremely opening. One is *Sapiens*. Yuval is an incredibly, I think he's a doctor at Harvard. He writes incredible stories about Homo sapiens and where we've come as a species. And if you think I sounded really intellectual, most of it's probably come from his book. But he does a lot, and he's, like I said, a professor. And the other I love is Stephen Fry. And if those of you are big into English comedy, he's you'll recognize him from like Blackadder and different classic English comedies. But he writes some incredible books about Greek mythology, and from a storytelling perspective on paper, it's incredible. And I want to just make one mention here as well when it comes to authenticity and stories, because these are nonfiction, but if we look at, well, I guess Greek mythology is a bit of fiction and a bit of history, they're not really sure. But some of the best stories that are fiction, and I really enjoy reading fiction books, and I do, it does resonate a lot to me when it comes to storytelling. But the best authors, if you look at like the author of Lord of the Rings, and his name is passing my name, but he actually served in Tolkien, in World War I and World War II, and a lot of what he described, and good authors, if you look at the author for James Bond, and it was rooted in real world experiences. They could bring to life authentic real life stories. So yeah, those are my two. Any other questions, guys? Because we could answer a few if you've got anything left, or.
Yeah, there's one left here from Bisa. Women can find it more difficult to be open to sharing their story in an effective and positive way in comparison to men. In the same way, women can find it harder to ask for pay rises and promotions. If you have zero confidence in championing your story and yourself, how do you start? That's a really good question. And I think, again, I went on a women's leadership course last year. And a lot of the work was, it was a course through Johnson & Johnson, but the whole course was not about the KPIs for work or anything. It was all about ourselves. So really it starts with that confidence, knowing your worth, knowing that you are good enough. And the journey starts really within. And yes, it is something that these limiting beliefs that we have as women, and I can tell you that I've fallen in that trap many, many times, and I'm still working on it. It's a journey, but I think every time you take a step forward and build that confidence, you put yourself out there. You look at, okay, what has come from it. Take another step. Keep moving forward. It's one step at a time. You don't go from 0 to 100 all in a day. It's definitely throughout your lifetime, but you need to resign yourself to the fact that you are student of life, student of these different topics, student of storytelling, student of leadership, where you are learning. So be teachable and learn constantly. Yeah.
We've got another question
Good.
as well. I love that answer. They keep coming in, so we'll keep going. Alex, I like it. Is there a way to use an analogy to add extra power to your story and cover more area? I do. I think, when it comes to an analogy and you're comparing one thing and another, the purpose of that is an explanation or clarification, right? So that when we look at the purpose of an analogy. So again, when we're looking at, I wouldn't say always, I think, depending on your situation and your audience, it will make sense. an analogy within a story can make a lot of sense when you're doing trying to describe something highly technical, right? And you're trying to get people to emotionally engage with your story, but they can't follow along. And you know, it's quite funny. My dad's a computer architect at American Express, and his mind's brilliant when it comes to how to explain servers and the languages behind it and whatnot. But he struggles to be able to sometimes engage me with his stories because I'm like, I don't get it. I don't know any of this stuff. And, you know, and it has to be some sort of medium. So I think it very much depends on your audience as to whether you should or whether it could help. But there's no reason why you can't, you know, use an analogy or put it through. I suppose the only caution I would throw to the wind is, you know, sometimes an analogy could seem quite patronizing depending on who you're speaking it to. So you don't have to work it in. I think it's it's just a good way of being able for people to relate better to your story.
Yeah. Wow, this was so good. Thank you, everyone, for just engaging, for coming on, spending the time with us. We really love to do these things. We really love to share content. And like I said, if anybody needs support, please reach out to either one of us. And we will see how can we support you. I think for us, it's about building a community, and you are part of our community. So thank you so much.
Yeah, just to mirror what Trinity said, Trinity does tons within career coaching. We do tons across doing stuff across social media platforms, recruitment. You know, we focus on things as a whole together in partnership. So if you have any questions or you want to drop us a line or an email, please don't hesitate. And we're going to try and drive as many of these as we can. We really enjoy it. And yeah, the most important thing is building a community, because this sort of stuff's so interesting, right? Where we get to have people participate and we get to chat. Like, I enjoy these much more than anything else because we actually feel you guys are connected. So thanks so much for joining.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye. Thanks, Trenchia.